Hi, Gold Duster 360 here. We're working on a 73 Plymouth Duster, and it has worn strut rod bushings. And I'm going to try to position the camera and the light so you can see the gap between the frame and the bushing. And what's happening is because the bushings are so loose, there's also a mating bushing on the other side that you can't see. It basically, or sandwiched that frame. And because of the gap there, because these bushings have collapsed with use over time, what they're doing is they're allowing the lower control arm to move fore and aft under braking and under acceleration, which causes the caster angles to continuously change, which causes erratic handling. So we're going to take the car out and drive it first and let you see what it's doing before we take it apart. Gold Duster 360 behind the wheel. I'm going to show what happens when you take your hands off the wheel. You jab the throttle, she's going to go left on you. What I'm thinking is happening is that lower control arm is moving around under power. It's changing the caster setting and the toe settings, and then it lets it veer off like that. The other thing she'll do is when you get on the brakes, she's going to pull left on you. She'll go right over the line. Okay, starting with the easiest bolt to turn first, we'll do the passenger side strut rod bolt. Alright, I got the bushing, I got the nut and the washer off. I can take the bushing off so you can see it. There's the old bushing, the front, and it's actually in pretty fair shape. There's the spacer. That slides over the shaft. A new one supplied with the Moog kit. Gold Duster 360 here. We're moving to the driver's side now. We're going to go ahead and do the strut rod bushings on this side. They also are not in great shape. You can actually rotate them with your finger, which means that they're compressed too much. You have to take out the plastic shielding and then the metal shield here. There's just some sheet metal screws to hold that stuff on. And then we're going to do the usual. We're going to take the brake caliper off, the rotor. We're going to disconnect here. We got two of these bolts, one on each side. We're going to just disconnect the lower ball joint from the steering spindle. And then we're also going to have to take off these sway bar bushings. Disconnect the shock. First thing we're going to do is we're going to take the tension off of the torsion bar by turning this hex right here about 18 turns, and we're going to take the tension off of it, and when you can wiggle this part back and forth and it's no longer in contact with this fulcrum, then you know that the bar doesn't have tension on it, and then it's safe to work on the suspension. Alright, so there's the bolt hanging down. You see it's been loosened. If you can move the bolt back and forth like that and up and down, you can see that little plate that it's attached to. If you can see that moving up and down, you know there's no tension on that torsion bar. Now we're going to remove the little plastic dust shields in the front and then the sheet metal shield in the rear. With the tension removed from the torsion bar, you can now proceed to remove the two large bolts holding the steering spindle to the lower ball joint. You can then remove the nut holding the lower control arm to the K-member. Removing the lower control arm nut off of the pivot shaft. Remove the front strut rod bushing retaining nut and washer. And just for an FYI, it's a 15/16 on both the bolt that holds the lower control arm to the K-member, and also on the bolts that holds the spindle to the lower ball joint. And it's a remove the retaining clip holding the torsion bar in place. This will allow the torsion bar to move towards the rear of the vehicle as you push the lower control arm back out of the way to gain access to the strut rod bushings. Okay, moving it back and out of the way. There she goes. And then we can take the torsion bar and we can just slide him backwards usually. He should come right out. There we go. Almost there. And with the lower control arm unbolted from the car, you can see how this arm works. You can see the top of the bolt right there where it rests, right there. And you can see how this whole thing pivots inside the arm. You can see the new bushing I put on last year, a couple years ago. There's a good shot of that. You can see how that moves back and forth. So when this end over here with the hex in it, when it's connected to that lower control arm and you tighten up that bolt and push it this way, it's twisting that arm, and it's also twisting that torsion bar, because that torsion bar is anchored in the back of the car. You can see where it's sticking out. There it is right there. And there's the hex that it goes into when it's pushed back in, right here. And that's how the torsion bar system works. The Moog Problem Solver K7068 set uses 4 identical bushings, but uses 2 different sized washers. It has a large outer and a small inner washer. It's a non-receiver type, unlike the factory style. So with the supplied sleeve that's slid on, you're going to take this one and it's going to go over it, and it's going to slide over that sleeve, and it's going to be a tight fit. So we'll go ahead and try to mash that on. You can see it's pretty tight. I may have to soap it, but right there it says with 1 piece sleeve supplied. There's the orientation. That's the small washer that fits inside the K-member. That's the large washer that fits outside the K-member that you can see from under the hood. There's the sleeve, and there's the bushing orientation, and you can see the steel, cast-in steel inner support on the replacement bushings. And that's how that's going to go back together. So we're not going to have it with that setup that some have showed, where they're actually taking this part on the outside one and fitting it like that. Now you're probably wondering why they had this oriented like this, which is different than the way the factory did it. And I think it's because when these bushings are centered properly in that K-member, you really want the washer just to apply the sandwiching force and to work around it so that you're not cupping it. Because once that's torqued down in that hole, it's not going anywhere. So it probably is designed to allow the bushing to last longer so that you're not grinding on the shoulders of it as the suspension arcs up and down through its movements as you bounce down the road. Something else that greatly simplifies installation is pressing this sleeve through the biscuit first for the bushing before you slide it onto the strut rod, instead of trying to press it all on at one time. The Moog replacement sleeve is shorter than the factory sleeve due to the different design of the bushings, to make sure that they get the proper amount of preload when you torque them down. And there it is. Got the sleeve pushed on. So it slides right on. And there's the bushing, the inner one. That's the small washer. And you see how I've got the convex, facing the convex instead of being inside the washer. And that's the way the instructions say to do it on the Moog problem solver bushing, which is the opposite of the factory, which would have had it going that way. The outer bushing, the one that you're going to see from the front of the car, is going to go on the normal factory way, like that. And this is where the control arm stopped moving rearward. It's really hard to get in here to see, but it's basically rubbing up against the exhaust header. Just another complication of having headers in a car. But that's why I can't get the control arm back far enough. I only need really probably another 4 inches. And but we'll just go ahead and we'll pop this strut rod loose on this end and we'll be good to go. Here's a nice shot of the lower ball joint disconnected from the steering spindle, and I'm just about to remove the nut off of the strut rod on the passenger side. With the passenger side components mostly back in place, I pre-torqued the Moog problem solver strut rod bushings without giving them full torque and using care not to damage those steel locating shoulders that each bushing has facing into the K-member. I noticed a slight gap where the bushing meets the K-member, which means that the strut rod bushings were not properly centered in that K-member, and I wanted to avoid damaging the bushings. So what I did, with them lightly preloaded, I took a long pry bar and moved the strut rod until I heard them pop into place. Now I know that they're properly located, and they'll torque down properly later when the car is sitting at proper ride height. Almost ready to put the wheels back on. With the vehicle set at proper ride height, you can now finish torquing the strut rod nut down. Tighten it to approximately 45 foot-pounds. The supplied mounting sleeve will keep you from over-compressing the bushing. Torque settings per instructions. Lower control arm to strut nut, 110 foot-pounds. 145 foot-pounds for the pivot nuts. 40 to 60 foot-pounds for the strut nuts. Insert cotter pins as required. I omitted that step. I always leave those things out. They originally had roll pins in them. There are lock nuts that are on there anyway, and I've cut myself on those things so many times over the years working underneath the car. I just leave them off. I've never had a problem with it. She's all back together and ready to go. I was just going to give you a quick shot of what the bushings look like when they're properly torqued. Notice how they look when they're torqued down. Each one of those was torqued to approximately 45 foot-pounds as suggested. You can feel the mounting sleeve supplied with the kit. You can feel the nut bottom out on it before it torques to 45 foot-pounds. Okay, with the car back together, just a couple of things I wanted to point out. As you can see, there's that lone nut and bolt that holds the lower control arm to the K-member. After you get the car all back together, before you get the ride height set, you can see where I've got the ride height here. I have just a little space between the jounts and the frame. And then you can see also here where I put in my new sway bar end link bushings. And the reason this has got that weird raised thing to it is this is one that I've had in the box for like 30 years. It came from Adco, and you had the option of putting a little coil spring in where that spacer is. I guess so if you wanted to have the anti-sway bar not as firm. I just prefer the firm setting. It doesn't really hurt anything. But anyway, you want to get the ride height set to where it was originally before you tighten that bolt all the way down, because you don't want to torque that lower control arm bushing up too much, which is that lone bushing that supports the vehicle where it bolts up to the frame. So you always want to have the car basically roll up and down the driveway a little bit and jounce it a few times and get it so that it's sitting at the road height where you want with the tension adjusted on the torsion bars before you tighten those nuts all the way down, because if you have that bushing tweaked in any way, it's not going to last very long. So same thing with the ones up here too. You want to make sure that you have the thing sitting where it was before so that you don't have any problems. Roadcast! That looked pretty good, didn't it? Ready? Yeah. Here we go. Give it one shot here, getting on the brakes and see how straight it stops. Hands completely off the wheel. Complete stop. Okay, not too shabby. Get that? Yeah. Thanks for watching. In our next video, we're going to show you how to check your wheel alignment with a simple caster camber bubble gauge, a tape measure, and some plastic trash bags.